Carlin said, "They say in America anyone can become president, and that's the problem."
Yep.
So we tend to take it for granted that the leader of the United States should be the president, but that hasn't always been the case. The framers of the Constitution never intended the chief executive to have powers that would overshadow the other two branches of government, as it certainly does today. Even the title president was not a foregone conclusion at the Constitutional Convention. Prior to the writing of the Constitution in 1787, no country had ever conceived of an office of the presidency. Until then, nations were most often ruled by hereditary monarchs, or in the case of Great Britain, by a prime minister. So, where does the term president come from? Well, it stems from the Latin presidere, which means to sit before. It refers to an officer who would sit before a gathering and would serve as the chairman or the foreman. Earlier in European history, it was used in an institutional context. For example, Oxford and Cambridge universities had presidents all the way back to the 15th century. It was also occasionally used for the heads of the 13 colonies, going back to Virginia in 1608, which had a president. In 1774, the presiding officer of the Continental Congress was also called president, but that was really a ceremonial title. So the Constitution gave the word president a whole new meaning, as we will see. Many in the young United States regarded monarchy as the worst form of government. The Declaration of Independence specifically cited the British monarch as the source for all problems besetting Americans in the 13 colonies. And so Thomas Jefferson said, he wrote in the Declaration of Independence that the history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. So clearly, Jefferson is putting the entire blame of the problems besetting the colonists in the lap of the King of Great Britain. And so there was a great fear of a strong leader. And that fear remained throughout the decade after independence was declared. And that is why the government of the Articles of Confederation was established. As you may remember from our first lecture, it was the government that prevailed from 1783 to 1787, but it had a very weak central government. It had no president because there was such fear of one person amassing too much power. But because this government proved incapable of solving the problems of the young nation, the Constitutional Convention was called to amend those articles. And the 55 delegates at the Constitutional Convention generally agreed that a stronger national government was necessary to replace the Articles of Confederation. The first issue to rouse the delegates was whether there should be one or several chief executives for the new country. Uh, James Wilson from Pennsylvania suggested that there should just be one chief executive. But Edmund Randolph of Virginia argued that a single chief executive would be very much like a monarch. And so instead, he proposed a three-person committee that would serve as the chief executives of the country. It was widely feared that endowing a single individual with enormous power would inevitably result in that person abusing those powers. The lesson that many Americans learned from their experience with the British was that liberty is threatened by executive power. And so, in proposing a new system of government, the founders were constantly concerned about the abuse of power. James Madison, in particular, knew a lot about human nature, and he wrote in Federalist 51, "Ambition must be made to counteract ambition." But most of the delegates at the Constitutional Convention were property owners, and they feared popular uprisings that might threaten their wealth and their position. In fact, just a year earlier, there was such a popular uprising called Shays' Rebellion. And so the delegates thought that a single executive might be able to respond more quickly to social disorder than a committee of 3 executives. And so, in the end, the convention voted strongly to have just a single executive. The next controversy addressed how this chief executive should be chosen. Should he be chosen by state legislatures, by Congress, or by popular vote? The feeling was that to allow Congress to elect the president would give too much power to the legislature. It would lead to intrigue and conspiracy because Congress would choose someone who would then be beholden to Congress, and that would blur the separation of powers. To let state legislatures elect the chief executive would give too much power to the states. To let the people select the chief executive was, as I mentioned in the first lecture, like letting a blind man make a choice of color, because the people in 1787 were largely uneducated and unfamiliar with anything outside their local region. Given the deficiencies of 18th century communication and transportation, it was almost impossible for any single person to acquire a national reputation. And so, in answer to the question, how should the chief executive be chosen, the delegates decided on the system that we are saddled with today, the Electoral College. And it was a compromise. Each state legislature was free to determine how their electors would be chosen. And some states put it up to popular vote, and others allowed the state legislature to appoint the electors. And we will return to the Electoral College shortly. But another question that arose was, how long should this chief executive serve? Alexander Hamilton was very much in favor of a powerful chief executive. And so Hamilton said, why not have him serve for life? Because Hamilton knew that George Washington was going to be elected the first president. And Washington had already refused the opportunity to become a king. So Hamilton felt that Washington would not act like a monarch, and therefore, since he was such an admirable individual, he should serve as chief executive for the rest of his life. But Madison, on the other hand, resisted that kind of pressure. Initially, the delegates approved a single term for the chief executive for the length of 7 years. But others argued that the executive should be allowed to run for re-election as a way of keeping a good leader in office. And therefore, his re-election would serve as a reward for good behavior. And so, as a compromise, it was decided that the chief executive should serve for a 4-year term with no limits on how many times he could be re-elected. And there was considerable controversy over what title to bestow upon the chief executive of the United States. The Senate thought that the title of president was too plain, and so they brainstormed a number of alternatives. Among the suggested title for the chief executive of the United States was His Elective Majesty, His Sacred Majesty, His Elective Highness, His Illustrious Highness, His Serene Highness, the National Executive, the Supreme Executive, His Exalted Highness, Chief Magistrate, and His Highness His Highness the President of the United States of America and Protector of their Liberties. Now, this fight over title was hardly frivolous. The debate actually went on for about several weeks. The controversy explored an important constitutional question. How much like a monarch should the head of the new republic resemble? And this new nation fought a revolution against the institution of monarchy. And so, ultimately, the question of title was resolved with Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution that said, quote, "No title of nobility shall be granted by the United States." Eventually, the delegates settled on the title of president because they were afraid that any of these other titles would make the chief executive more like a monarch. In addressing this fear of a too powerful chief executive, the Constitution writers finally agreed that the only way to guarantee the preservation of the republic and to prevent tyranny was by having the separation of powers between the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. And we saw that during the first lecture. And they instituted the balance of powers to protect any one branch from becoming too powerful. But there was also considerable ambivalence over what exact powers should be granted to the president. The delegates wanted a president strong enough to prevent Congress from dominating the government, but not so strong as to become a despot. They knew Washington would wield power responsibly, but would his successors be trusted to wield power? Ben Franklin cautioned the convention that the first man put at the helm, meaning Washington, would be a good one. Nobody knows what sort may come afterwards. So this is what the framers had to weigh: how much power to give to the president. Well, one power they agreed upon is the power to veto laws passed by Congress. James Wilson and Alexander Hamilton wanted the president to have absolute power. That is, the president should be able to veto laws, and that will be the end of it. He had the absolute power to kill a law. But others rose in opposition, remembering how the British king and royal governors would cast absolute vetoes against the laws passed by colonial legislatures. And so again, compromise saved the day. It was agreed that yes, the president could veto laws passed by Congress, but that Congress could override presidential vetoes with a 2/3 vote in each house of Congress. Another question was, who should direct the armed forces? And so it was agreed that the president shall be commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and of the militia of the several states. But they also made sure that Congress and not the president had the power to raise armies and declare war. Now, what if there was a foreign invasion when Congress was not in session. So the delegates agreed that the president should have the power to repel attacks, but not have the power to officially declare war. That power was left to Congress. Another power that was granted to the president and will be exercised by President Trump in the coming weeks is the power to pardon. Hamilton suggested that the president be granted the power to pardon criminals, quote, to make exceptions in favor of unfortunate guilt. The delegates agreed, but they limited the president's power of pardon to offenses against the United States. That is, for violation of federal law, not state law. And that has real importance today, because if Trump somehow manages to get himself pardoned, let's say if he resigned and President Pence then pardoned Trump, he would still not be in the clear, because the state of New York is investigating Trump, and the pardon power does not extend to the states. And so once out of office, Trump can be convicted by the Attorney General of New York State. Another power that was granted to the president was the power to negotiate treaties. At the start of the convention, most delegates assumed that the power to make treaties with other countries should be vested in Congress. But once again, Alexander Hamilton argued that the executive branch should exercise powers related to foreign governments and should therefore have the power to make treaties with the advice and consent of the Senate. And so, in the end, Hamilton's argument proved most persuasive, and the convention agreed that, yes, the president has the power to negotiate and make treaties, but the Senate must approve those treaties by a 2/3 majority. Another power granted to the president is the power of appointment. This was one of the most contentious issues at the convention. Most delegates at first agreed that it was the legislature and not the executive that should have the power to appoint people to non-elective offices. Once again, James Wilson and Alexander Hamilton wanted to make the appointment of judges and ambassadors and other government officials a purely presidential responsibility with no input from Congress. Once again, there was a compromise. The compromise was that, yes, the president could appoint judges and ambassadors, but they must be approved by a majority of the Senate. And we saw how that played out with Trump's appointment of Kavanaugh and then Amy Coney Barrett. The Senate had to approve that. Now, another power granted to the president was the power to receive ambassadors. It's unclear whether the delegates meant this power to be ceremonial or substantive. But in practice, the power to receive ambassadors gives the president the right to determine which governments the United States will recognize diplomatically. So the power to recognize a country is solely left up to the president. And so, for example, in 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt decided to recognize the Soviet Union. And in 1979, President Jimmy Carter decided to recognize the People's Republic of China. Another power granted to the president is advisory legislative power. The convention decided that, quote, he shall from time to time give information to the legislature of the state of the union and recommend to their consideration such measures as he deems necessary and expedient. And so when we watch the State of the Union address, that gives the president the opportunity to suggest which laws Congress should pass. By the way, Biden will not give a State of the Union address this January because he has just become president. And so a new president does not give a State of the Union address until his second year in office. Finally, the last power granted to the president was the power of chief administrator. The Constitution says he shall take care that the laws are faithfully executed. And that is really the president's primary purpose, to administer and enforce laws passed by Congress. Now, during the course of the convention, the delegates decided to provide situations in which the executive may have to be removed from office. Even Hamilton realized that there needed to be some check on the power of a president who became more like a dictator, someone who would become a demagogue. Now, while Hamilton could not possibly have had Donald Trump in mind,
yes,
he did say this: when a man unprincipled in private life, desperate in his fortune, bold in his temper, despotic in his ordinary demeanor, known to have scoffed in private at the principles of liberty, when such a man is seen to mount the hobby horse of popularity, to join in the cry of danger to liberty, to take every opportunity of embarrassing the general government and bringing it under suspicion, to flatter and fall in with all the nonsense of zealots of the day, it may justly be suspected that his object is to throw things into confusion, that he may ride the storm and direct the whirlwind. So this is a cogent statement in 1792 about the fear that a president might want to amass more power than the Constitution intended to grant. And that is why Hamilton argued in the Federalist Papers that impeachment should be included in the Constitution. But which body should be empowered to remove the president? Some suggested that the Supreme Court be the final arbiter for the conviction and removal of the chief executive. But Hamilton stridently pushed back on that idea. He argued that only senators could be independent enough to thoroughly judge a president, instead of judges on the Supreme Court who may have been appointed by that same president who is under accusation. And so the delegates decided that the House of Representatives would have the sole power to vote to impeach a president, but that the Senate had the power to remove the president by a 2/3 vote. And that the grounds for removal should include treason, bribery, corruption, maladministration, and high crimes and misdemeanors. But they decided that the term corruption was too vague, and so they got rid of it. Then Madison argued that limiting impeachment to treason or bribery would exclude other attempts to subvert the Constitution. And so he proposed maladministration. But others argued that maladministration might mean nothing more than being an unpopular president. And so Madison moved to substitute all of these for the terms high crimes and misdemeanors. And so that is how the Constitution describes the grounds for impeachment. Americans have debated the meaning of this decidedly open-ended phrase, high crimes and misdemeanors, ever since. And then the issue came up about what happens if a president becomes disabled. Although the delegates were deliberate in considering the grounds for presidential impeachment, they were less reflective on what to do if a president became disabled. And so disability was left undefined in the Constitution, and there was no process created to determine whether a president was disabled or how to transfer the powers and duties of a president to a successor if the president became disabled. Instead, the delegates merely named the vice president as the person to succeed a disabled president. But as we will see in January, the 25th Amendment does address this issue. Another issue related to the president was salary. How much should he be paid? Some argued that Congress should set the salary of the president, but Madison was afraid that would infringe on the executive's independence. That would allow Congress to control the president by threatening to raise or lower his compensation if he was willing to do what Congress wanted. Benjamin Franklin suggested not paying the president at all, because in his view, a salary would wed the love of power with the love of money, and that would lead to corruption. But the delegates eventually decided that the president's salary should be independent of Congress. And they added the stipulation that he shall not receive any emoluments from the United States. And we will talk about emoluments in a moment. Then they had to decide what should be the qualifications of a president. And so it was decided that a presidential candidate must be at least 35 years of age. He must be a natural-born citizen or a citizen at the time of the adoption of the Constitution. Now, that was put in there for Alexander Hamilton, because Hamilton was born in the British West Indies. However, at the time of the adoption of the Constitution, he was a citizen. And it was decided that a president must be a resident of the United States for at least 14 years. Now, the delegates presumed that a minimum age of 35 would guarantee a certain maturity and would give voters a chance to assess a presidential candidate's political record. The 14-year minimum residency requirement was intended to eliminate British sympathizers who had fled to England during the Revolutionary War. And so by requiring at least 14 years residence, that would eliminate any British sympathizer who wanted to return and run for president. The citizenship requirement was intended to eliminate popular foreign military leaders like Baron von Steuben of Prussia, who had emigrated to the United States during the Revolution. Another issue that came up had to do with the oath of office. Unlike the oath of office for most state governors, the convention barred the imposition of a religious oath of office on the president or for any other officials of the national government. In addition, the Constitution provided that there would be no religious test as a qualification for any office or public trust, although it would be 172 years before any candidate other than a Protestant would be elected president. That was when John Kennedy became the first Catholic president in 1960. So now let us take a closer look at Article 2 of the Constitution. Remember, Article 1 related to Congress. Article 2 relates to the president. The president is the only elected official who represents all the American people. Think about that. He is the only one who all the American people vote for. When you vote for Congress, you're voting for state officials. But when you vote for president, you're voting for a president of the entire country. And the office of the presidency today is arguably the most powerful position in the world. But although Donald Trump claims that Article 2 gives him power to do anything he wants, he actually said that. In fact, Article 2 clearly delineates exactly what the powers of the president are. And those are the powers that we just went over. That executive power shall be vested in the president. These are the qualifications. And they decided not to set any term limits. So when the Constitution was written, a president could get reelected again and again and again. However, our first president, George Washington, decided to not run after serving 2 terms. And that set a precedent, which every successor followed until Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1940 decided to run for a 3rd term. He got elected and then ran for a 4th term and got elected. But then the 22nd Amendment, passed in 1951, set a 2-term limit. So today, no president can serve for more than 2 terms. Article 2, Section 1, also mandates that the president shall not receive emoluments. Emoluments refer to financial gain from serving as chief executive. And so, for example, when a foreign government gives a gift to the president may not keep that gift for himself personally. That gift belongs to the United States. Now, currently, some people claim that when foreigners stay at the Trump Hotel in Washington, that represents an emolument, that is, a foreign gift to Trump for his personal value. Now, there has not been any court case to test whether Trump has violated the emoluments clause. Much of Article 2, Section 1 addresses how the president should be elected. And as we all know, we have the system of the Electoral College. And here's the map showing the electoral votes of each state. The electoral votes of each state are determined by how many representatives and senators that state has. And just earlier this week, the electors met in their respective state capitals to cast their ballots based on which candidate won the popular vote in their state. And as we know, President-elect Biden won 305 electoral votes to win the election. 307. Well, you won over 300. Now, the Constitution said that if no candidate wins a majority of the electoral vote, then the House of Representatives would determine who would be president. And the House of Representatives did that in the election of 1824. And as we all know, because of the winner-take-all aspect of the electoral vote, meaning that whoever wins the popular vote in a state wins all the state's electoral votes. That makes it possible for a candidate to win the popular vote, but to lose the electoral vote. And that has happened 5 times in American history. In 1824, in 1876, 1888, 2000, and 2016. So there are many people who feel that the Electoral College system is no longer adequate or appropriate for the election of the president in the 21st century. But there are arguments in favor of keeping the Electoral College. Using electors instead of the popular vote was intended to safeguard against uninformed or uneducated voters by putting the final decision in the hands of electors who would most likely possess information necessary to make the best decisions. So these electors were the best educated elite. Another argument is that the Electoral College ensures that all parts of the country are involved in selecting the president, meaning that the winner will actually be serving the needs of the entire country. Without the Electoral College, rural areas and small towns would be marginalized. Candidates would only campaign in big cities. But having the Electoral College, that gives power to some of the smaller, less populated states. And that ensures that the entire country is involved in selecting the president. Another argument for the Electoral College is that if the election was just based on popular vote, it would be possible for a candidate who may receive the highest number of votes, but not actually having a majority. Whereas with the Electoral College, the candidate has to have a majority of the electoral vote. So for example, if we look at the 1968 presidential election, in this election, Richard Nixon got just 43.2% of the popular vote. That's a plurality, but it's not a majority. However, he got 56.1% of the electoral votes. So the argument here is that having the president elected by electoral votes, he is guaranteed to have a majority. Whereas if it just depends on the percentage of popular vote, he could have a plurality, but not necessarily a majority. And by giving the president a majority of electoral votes, that gives more credibility to his election. This happened again in 1992, when Bill Clinton won just 43% of the popular vote, yet he won the election because he won 68.8% of the electoral votes. And if we look at the election of 2012, Barack Obama won by just 2% in the popular vote, but by 11% in the electoral vote. So the argument is that the electoral vote guarantees that a president will win the majority of the electoral vote, and that gives more credibility to his election. Well, there are many arguments against the Electoral College. The main argument is that the reasons why the Electoral College was devised, those reasons are no longer relevant. People today are much better educated in 1789, and therefore they should be the ones to elect the president, that it should be up to popular vote. Another argument against the Electoral College is that it gives too much power to those swing states, and it allows the presidential election to be decided by just a handful of states. And we saw that in the 2020 election, where both Biden and Trump campaigned mostly in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Florida. Those were the swing states. And the argument is that leaves the rest of the states out of the campaigning. The two main political parties can count on winning electoral votes in certain states, such as California. It's assumed that the Democrats are going to win California. And so Biden and Trump never really campaigned in California, just as Biden did not campaign in Indiana or in many southern states. Because of the Electoral College, presidential candidates only need to pay attention to a limited number of states that can swing the election one way or another. Another argument against the Electoral College is that it ignores the will of the people. And this is a chart showing presidents who have won the election without winning the popular vote. And so in 2016, Trump lost the popular vote by 2.1%, yet he won the electoral vote by 14%. In 2000, Bush lost the popular vote by a half percentage point, but he won the electoral vote by almost 1%. And as you can see, this has happened other times in American history. Now, after the writing of the Constitution, James Madison admitted that the Electoral College was a shoddy piece of work. He said it was done while the delegates were worn out and they wanted to go home. So that's what they agreed upon. And Madison added that he hoped that the obvious flaws in the Electoral College system would be corrected by later constitutional amendments. But that has not occurred. So why hasn't the Electoral College been changed? Why are we still stuck with it? Actually, there have been 900 attempts to alter or abolish the Electoral College since 1800. And they have all failed because in order to get rid of it, you need a constitutional amendment. But a constitutional amendment requires supermajorities in both houses of Congress and in state legislatures. In order to propose an amendment, it has to have the approval of 2/3 of both houses of Congress. And in order for it to become part of the Constitution, it has to be adopted by 3/4 of the states. But because the Electoral College favors small states, those states would never approve an amendment to get rid of the Electoral College. Now, there are other reasons that some people do not want to get rid of the Electoral College. Before the Civil War, those who defended slavery defended the Electoral College because it gave the South a powerful voting bloc. And after the Civil War, those defenders of racial segregation in the Jim Crow era also opposed getting rid of the Electoral College for the same reason, that it gave power to the southern states. It guaranteed the South a powerful voting bloc. Now, the Republican Party today knows it cannot win a nationwide popular vote. Since 1988, a Republican presidential nominee has won the popular vote just one time, and that was in 2004, when George Bush defeated John Kerry. Therefore, Republicans will never vote to get rid of the Electoral College. That is the only way a Republican presidential candidate could get elected. But there are two other possibilities of getting rid of the Electoral College. One possibility is to have states allot their electoral votes proportionally. Now, today, 2 states do that, Maine and Nebraska. And so if one candidate wins 60% of the popular vote in Maine, that candidate wins 60% of the electors. But the losing candidate will have 40% of the electors. In other words, this does away with the winner-take-all formula. if other states would adopt that, that would make the Electoral College much more democratic, and it would align much more closely with the popular vote. Another possibility is what is called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. This is an agreement that 15 states have entered into, along with Washington, D.C. And these 15 states have agreed that whoever wins the national popular vote will win all the electoral votes in their states, even if the other candidate won the popular vote in their state. Now, these 15 states collectively have 196 electoral votes. If other states join in with this compact to bring the number up to 270, then that will replace the system that we have now. But there's no guarantee that that will happen. And even if enough state legislatures agree to enter the compact, they could also agree to leave the compact at a future time. And if they did, we would once again be stuck with the winner-take-all electoral system that we have today. Now, if all of this is confusing, I will be addressing your questions at the end of this presentation. Okay, now let us turn to Article 2, Section 2, which addresses the duties and responsibilities of the president. And so we've already mentioned that the president would serve as the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, which became very controversial during the Korean War, when the commander in the field, General Douglas MacArthur, tried to override the orders of the President of the United States, Harry Truman. And ultimately, Truman fired MacArthur, insisting that the president was the commander-in-chief and that his decisions should prevail. As we've mentioned, the president has the right to pardon anyone who committed a federal crime. The president has the power to make treaties, but they must be approved by 2/3 of the Senate. And the president, with the consent of the Senate, can appoint ambassadors and justices to the Supreme Court and federal courts. Now, Section 3 requires that the president deliver a State of the Union address to Congress. Now, the president does not have power to introduce legislation to Congress, but he can announce his legislative agenda in the State of the Union address and suggest that Congress pass certain laws. Section 3 also states that the president shall receive ambassadors, which, as we've mentioned, is the power to recognize foreign governments. Finally, Article 2, Section 4 says that the president, vice president, and all civil officers of the United States can be removed from office on impeachment for conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. So once again, what does high crimes and misdemeanors mean? Some argue that it means only serious crimes that threaten the security of the nation. Others believe it includes malfeasance in office, such as colluding with a foreign power or violation of the Emoluments Clause. These might not otherwise be considered a crime, but it certainly does constitute malfeasance in office. Now, as we know, 3 presidents have been impeached: Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton, and Donald Trump, but none of the 3 were convicted. 1 Supreme Court justice has been impeached, Samuel Chase, in 1804, but he was acquitted by the Senate. 15 federal judges have been impeached throughout American history. 8 of those 15 were removed from office. Okay, so all of this covers the precise powers granted to the president in the Constitution. However, the Constitution also leaves considerable leeway for specific presidents to shape the executive office. For example, the Constitution left unclear the extent of the powers that were implied by the president's responsibilities for war, peace, and diplomacy. Also, the Constitution is not very clear on how the president shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And as a result, the Constitution has given rise to more than 2 centuries of conflict about the proper scope of presidential authority. Over the decades, the powers of the presidency have grown exponentially, far greater than anything that the framers intended. In fact, the increased power of the presidency today is sometimes referred to as the imperial presidency. This was a term that the historian Arthur Schlesinger gave to the office of the presidency after World War II, because the president has accrued considerable power beyond that which the Constitution intended. And so, to avoid conflict with the Senate, which must approve treaties by a 2/3 majority, presidents have sometimes relied upon executive agreements to achieve their foreign policy goals. An executive agreement is an agreement between the President of the United States and the leader of another country, and it does not require approval by the Senate. And so, for example, in 1940, Britain was at war with Nazi Germany, and the United States was officially isolationist. Britain was desperate for American military aid, and President Franklin D. Roosevelt wanted to help Britain. But the country was isolationist, and he knew Congress would not agree to any treaty giving help to Great Britain. So Roosevelt made an executive agreement with Winston Churchill to deliver 50 US destroyers to Great Britain. In exchange, Britain gave the United States military bases in the Caribbean. So that was done by executive agreement to bypass the Congress's approval. Now, in addition to executive agreement, there is something called executive orders. And this is based on Section 1 that says the executive power shall be vested in the President of the United States, and that the President shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And so, this is the basis for presidents who issue executive orders without having to go through Congress. And they have the force of law. And so, for example, in 1948, President Truman wanted to desegregate the armed forces, but he knew that Congress would never agree because Southerners in the House and Senate would oppose it. And so President Truman issued an executive order to desegregate the armed forces. Since 1789, presidents have issued more than 15,000 executive orders. Here is a chart showing the number of executive orders that have been issued from the presidency of Gerald Ford to Donald Trump. But the numbers for Trump is incomplete because his presidency has not been completed. Now, Yep, but they can see it.
Oh, okay.
Now, these executive orders remain in force until Congress enacts a conflicting law to do away with the executive order, or courts can overrule executive orders, or later presidents can rescind them. So, for example, Trump rescinded almost all of Obama's executive orders. And there's no doubt that Biden will rescind almost all of Trump's executive orders.
Amen.
Now, in addition to executive agreements and executive orders, presidents have also increased their powers through a device known as signing statements. And so you can see here that a signing statement is a written pronouncement issued by the president upon the signing of a bill into law. Now, very often when a president signs a bill into law, he could write that this is a good law, that it meets certain needs. That is considered a signing statement, and there's nothing controversial about that. However, sometimes presidents could claim that they think that some parts of the law is good, but other parts are not. And therefore, they intend to ignore it, or they do not intend to completely enforce that law. And that becomes very controversial. Now, the Constitution does not state that a president may deem part of a bill invalid when they sign it into law. That would be called line item veto, and that has been ruled unconstitutional. But executive branch legal teams in administrations of both parties have maintained that signing statements are legal and useful, in part because it prevents the president from vetoing important laws over some minor flaw. Some critics argue that the proper presidential action should be either to veto legislation or to faithfully execute the laws. If the president says in a signing statement that a part of a bill is unconstitutional, why doesn't he just veto the entire bill? Often the president will argue that the good of the bill outweighs the bad. And so signing statements enable a president to sign a bill into law, even if the president thinks that there's some minor flaw. The first president to issue a signing statement was James Monroe. James Monroe was the fifth president of the United States. Between Monroe's time and the 1980s, only about a dozen signing statements were issued. But then in 1981, Ronald Reagan ushered in an era of prolific signing statements. And so presidents from Ronald Reagan to Barack Obama have issued about 120 signing statements so far. So here's an example of a signing statement that President Obama employed with the National Defense Authorization Act. He signed this act into law, but he wrote that he would not detain any American citizen without due process and trial, even though this law states that he could do this if those Americans are suspected of aiding and abetting terrorists. Well, Obama didn't think that was such a great idea. And so he signed the bill into law, but in his signing statement, he said he would not detain American citizens without due process and trial if they were suspected of aiding and abetting terrorists. And finally, we have the theory of the unitary executive. According to this theory, since the Constitution assigns the president all of the executive power, this theory maintains that the president could set aside laws that attempt to limit his power when it comes to national security. Now, that's an enormous power. Critics charge that this theory effectively places the president above the law. Those who advocate broad presidential power argue that it is necessary to defend the country against the threat posed by terrorism. And the unitary executive theory, as implemented by the second Bush administration, was used to justify unchecked presidential power over the use of military force, so that President Bush was able to send troops to Iraq and to Afghanistan without having to ask Congress for a declaration of war. That it justifies the detention and interrogation of prisoners, as well as extraordinary rendition and intelligence gathering. Now, this issue came up when the Senate Judiciary Committee voted to approve a bill to protect Special Counsel Robert Mueller from being fired by President Trump. The bill passed in committee by a 14-7 vote, but Republican senators voted the bill down, citing constitutional considerations based on the unitary executive theory. And so there are those like former Attorney General William Barr, who strongly believes in the unitary executive theory. And that is why Barr, as Attorney General, supported Trump in some very questionable extensions of presidential power. So, to sum up, the executive branch today is far more powerful than when it was conceived of in 1789 because of executive agreements, executive orders, signing statements, and the unitary theory of the president. And so today, the framers would be shocked at how powerful the presidency has become. Okay, so now we will take a look